Hey guys, welcome here and welcome back to the Blue Collar Future podcast. This is the first solo episode of 2024. It's crazy. This will be episode number 45. And, that means only, 7 more episodes to go until we get to a year's worth of podcast episodes. Awesome. Couldn't be doing it without all of your guys' support. Everybody who listens, everybody who's given me awesome words of encouragement and signs that I'm going in the right direction. This is always a learning curve, and there's always things that we could be doing different and better. And over time, this is going to turn into something completely different. I can tell already, completely different than what I thought. I tell people a lot of the time that I had no idea where I wanted this podcast to go when I started. And the fact that it's come to where it's at is crazy to me. People I've met, experiences I've had, the topics we've talked about. I mean, I'm almost turning into more of a health and fitness for contractors podcast than anything else, but we're going to keep the spirit of the original idea of the podcast, which is talking about the future of blue collar work and the future of the trades as close as we can. This episode, I put out a question on my Instagram asking about topics to talk about, and somebody said recognizing when it's time to pivot versus when being forced to pivot. And I really liked that because I've had a lot of experiences like that, and a lot of people have very similar experiences throughout the course of their time when they're, going to school, or whether they're going in a direction in their business or with their family, whatever it is, knowing when it's time to pivot versus being forced to pivot and making the decision in the moment. This is really the difference between being proactive and reactive, which, as most people know, it is super important to be proactive versus reactive. Let's go into a little bit of what kind of some proactive and reactive, what that really means. Being proactive is just, I look at it as being aware of your situation. So nowadays, it's super hard to be aware of your situation because there's so much going on. There's so many noises, social media, news. They're always trying to distract you from what's important and what really matters. Being proactive can be hard because there's so much noise. It's hard to block out what doesn't matter and focus on what does. In my mind, being proactive means being all in on what you're doing, paying attention to what's going on around you, and thinking about what you can be doing better, different, what you need to change. As long as you're doing all of that stuff, your mind is going to be thinking solution based and preemptively, um, preventing problems, getting rid of distractions, doing all those things because you're constantly thinking about what you could be doing rather than what you are doing in the moment. Now, being reactive is super easy. And a lot of people end up being more reactive than proactive because, again, all of the noise, it's hard to focus. So it really just comes down to being able to focus. But being reactive looks more like going about your day, just showing up, doing your work, and when you go home, you're not really thinking about anything else, which can be good. And there's a time and place for when you shouldn't be thinking about anything outside of work. You shouldn't be thinking about work because you need a reset, right? But being reactive is more like living your life like that, where you never really think about the next step. You're not planning, you're not anticipating, you're not looking to be better. And some people are fine being like that. A lot of times, all that does is lead to problems because if you are not looking for what could be happening and how you can improve. First of all, you're never going to improve, but then when something happens, you're caught with your thumb up your ass because you don't know what to do. And you're caught in the middle of something, throws you for a loop, and then you're derailed for weeks or months at a time trying to fix problems that maybe not would have been prevented if you were thinking more proactively, but could have been dealt with easier and quicker because of the mindset that you're in constantly that you have to be in to be proactive. So, this idea of recognizing when it's time to pivot, I have a lot to talk about on this and kind of a lot of different thoughts. Recognizing pivot time is hard because on one hand, you have knowing when it's time to pivot, but also thinking that you know when it's time to pivot when really you're really just quitting too soon to see any benefits of what you've been doing. So I think this idea of pivoting is only possible, recognizing when it's time to pivot is only possible when you're proactive and only possible when you're making small changes. Okay, because 1% changes, 1 degree changes every single day is what you should be doing to begin with. And when you're doing that, these small 1 degree shifts, it's much easier to notice when something isn't working and to make a small 1 degree shift. If the pivot that you're thinking about and talking about when this is going down is more of a when it's time to just give up and quit on something, a lot of times there is no time to do that because when you make these big changes immediately, a lot of times it throws way too many things for a loop and makes things way harder than if you had just continued doing the simple basic things. So I think there's a little bit of a difference between a 1 degree shift and let's say a 20 degree shift, a 20 degree pivot, or even a 50, 90 degree pivot is way different than just these little 1 degree changes and shifts. So you should be aiming to do a 1 degree change every single day. One extra change, one extra task, one more thing to better yourself, to better your company, to spend more time with your family, whatever it is. So recognizing when it's time to pivot is hard because you should be pivoting all the time. But if we're talking about a big pivot, a big change, that's hard. When you start up a company, for example, within the first 5 years, if you will come across times where you just want to throw in the towel and make huge changes and make huge pivots. And the first 5 years of a business most businesses fail within the first 5 years because it's hard and because people don't want to make these 1 degree shifts. So recognizing this pivot time to make sure that doesn't happen is very difficult. If we're talking about pivoting to jump from one kind of course of action to another because we've spent, months working towards it and we know it's not working out, this is a little bit different as well. What I'm some experiences I've had is a lot of you have seen that I started the community for the podcast, and I started it with very little um, worry of whether or not it would fail. And I wasn't thinking about it failing necessarily, but I knew that if it didn't work out, then I wouldn't mind. And I was mindful of where I was headed and mindful of the amount of work needed to make this community work. And started setting everything up, going through the motions and doing a little bit better every single day. And it was going okay. It was going good. And doing the longer recordings, figuring all of that out. And that was the thing I wanted to do to begin with is offer longer podcast interviews for people that wanted to hear it. And I came up on some news. We are expanding our family this year, and I have a lot going on doing the concrete, um, doing this podcast, doing our websites. And I started to realize that this community was taking a ton of time from me. It was taking way more time than I really imagined and thought it was going to be. And and I knew it was going to take a lot of time and it was going to be a lot of work, but it was taking just more than I was ready for and more than I was anticipating. So when we got that news, I had been mindful of what I had been doing, and I made the choice to shut that down, but to pivot to posting subscriptions on Apple, which I didn't really know you could do very well until I saw that opportunity and I saw, okay, this is a way for me to make a slight shift in what I was doing and save me a ton of time, save me a ton of headache so I can focus on other priorities. We have a lot of things coming this year, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to dedicate the time to growing this coaching group that I had a ton of ideas for this year. I knew I wasn't going to be able to do that. And that's okay. I just knew that at the end of the day, continuing the podcast is the most important part. So I made the decision to stop the group, but still do the interviews and offer them as a subscription on Apple, which by the time I stopped the group, that was really all it was for anyways. That was really all was implemented and all that was it was available, but it was costing me money to keep the group going, and I wasn't really able to invest the time into it to make it better. So when we talk about making these pivots, recognizing when it's time to pivot, you have to dedicate enough time to it to know whether or not it is working or not working. Once you know whether or not it's working or not working, you can make a decision based on priorities. Knowing when to pivot has a lot to do with knowing your priorities, because a lot of times a pivot isn't necessary rather than doubling down on what you are doing and making these small changes and shifts over time to improve what you're doing so that it is more beneficial to you. When you are thinking proactively with a with more of a solution-based mindset to problems, and you are aware of what's going on, you can notice opportunities and know when it's just time to shift and pivot what you're doing. With our website business, we noticed there were so many people coming to us that were more of a different type of customer that didn't want a big, expensive website. And we weren't really actively chasing down people to do big custom websites for. So we noticed it was time to make a shift to offer a little bit of a more cost-effective product in templates, which we are going to be releasing soon. They're going to be a way for people to have a template, but have it be a good and easy website option. Because a lot of website templates, even though they're pretty cheap, are super hard and not user friendly to get looking professional. So a lot of times people will go with a website template and it won't look good, won't look professional, but they've done it and they're going to stick with it for, however long until they get a custom website. This is a good way for people to get a custom template. We noticed it was time to make a pivot because with the changes coming this year, this is going to be a little bit more time effective for us, a little bit more time effective for our clients, and a little bit more options for people to have. Another example is when I was going to school. Going to college makes it hard to notice these pivot points because it's hard to know what is time to pivot versus just wanting to give up on what you're doing. It's hard to know the difference between quitting too soon and knowing when it's time to quit, essentially. So I had been focusing on engineering for probably 10 years. And by the time COVID hit and I was in school, I started to realize I wasn't sure if I even wanted to do the engineering to begin with. And I liked my math, I liked my science classes, I liked some of my programming classes, but I didn't care for the engineering. And it just was a nagging thought in the back of my mind. It wasn't really that I wanted to quit or it was too hard or anything. I just didn't really think I wanted to do it, and it wasn't really aligning with my priorities. It wasn't aligning with the lifestyle I wanted to live. The money I didn't really care for, and a lot of what I had seen wasn't really that good when you graduate, and was realizing it wasn't fitting with my priorities. And I decided to stop going to the university. Really liked learning. I really liked going to school. I just didn't think it was interesting enough to do for a career. And I started to realize I liked doing concrete and being outside and doing being active, which is a hard thing for people to come to understand that they actually like doing a trade job because it's so pre-programmed to go to college, go to college. So when you don't go to school, it's you're somehow lesser than. At least that's been my experience. There's almost a subconscious thought that you're not as good as somebody who went to college because you don't have a degree. And I started to come around to that where I realized maybe I didn't actually want to be an engineer. Maybe it didn't align with my priorities. So made I decided to stop for a while and focus on concrete. And around maybe the next year, I realized that you could be a web developer pretty easy with limited education and really just proof of skill. So by doing projects and showing that you know how. So I did a certificate, a 6-month program through the university here, and I was going to do that. But then, I really just started to come to the realization I actually really liked trade work. So this is how the podcast started, is I really liked being active, working in a trade job, doing all that stuff. And I didn't care for being at a computer all day. Realizing when it's time to pivot versus realizing when you're just quitting too soon is hard. And really, it just comes down to priorities because most of the time when you're making a big pivot, you are just quitting too soon. But it comes down to, is this aligning with your priorities still? Will it be aligning with your priorities where you see it going? Knowing a pivot point is important. So with that, I with the web development, I decided to, I was still sort of focusing on getting out of concrete, but by this time I was coming around to the fact that I still liked it. I did like it. And realizing that I could start a business and, do some of that stuff. And my wife was a web developer, so it kind of worked out where I could talk to contractors and offer websites for contractors. And so is it really I gave up too soon on engineering, or were these little pivot points setting me up to be able to offer websites to contractors who I'm around all the time, setting me up to have the skills and capabilities to help people with their digital presence, which is where I'm headed with this is I started noticing all these signs, these pivot points where I noticed things weren't aligning with my priorities, but making this small pivot was creating this life that I wanted to have. When I started this podcast, I had been looking for a way to tie together concrete and websites because that's what I was always doing. So, starting this podcast, I was like, okay, this is something that I can talk about websites, I can talk about concrete, I can talk about health and fitness, which I'm super passionate about, and it all ties together. Knowing pivot points can lead you from one possibly beneficial outcome to a very much so better outcome that fits your priorities and it fits your values. So if we're talking about when you're starting something up and when you're heading in a direction and you start to think that you don't want to do it or it's too hard or you want to quit, make a list of your priorities and your values. And if it's not aligning with those, well, then it's just not going to work out anyways. The reason why college is hard and the reason why people spend so much time in college is because they don't spend enough time out, like the school system, the parents, the kids themselves don't spend enough time looking at their priorities and their values and where they want to be in 5 years or 10 years. So the advice is always go to college. And the counselors at the schools, they don't know what you want to do as a high schooler. You don't even know what you want to do as a high schooler. And if you start into college and you realize that you can do the work and you sort of enjoy it, you can sort of morph your priorities and your values around your career that you're chasing. But if you don't know, then you just spend all of your college trying to figure out what you like, which is a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It's what happens to a lot of people. A lot of people get almost all the way through a degree and decide to change and spend another 2 or 3 years there, where if they had just spent more time at the beginning of their college mapping out where they wanted to be in 5 or 10 years, maybe it would be different. But you never know. You never know. It's always a guessing game on what could have or should have happened. And that's not necessarily the important part. The important part is being aware of what you're doing, making these small changes, small 1 degree shifts to be better, to do better, put more work in. And over time, you start to notice more opportunities. And knowing a pivot time is really noticing an opportunity that you can chase because you're mindful about what's going on. Now, if we go look at all of these things from a reactionary standpoint, if you were going to school and spending all this time, say I was spending all this time going to engineering and it just wasn't working out, I just wasn't good at it, and I didn't put the work in to be better, wasting all my time and then realizing I don't want to do it, and then failing out of classes, failing out of my degree, and then deciding to make a change, that's super reactive. And it's even worse than being proactive. Because as long as you're being proactive about whatever it is that you're doing, knowing when it's time to pivot or even being forced to pivot is fine because you're already 10 steps ahead, making sure that it's going to work out because you're already looking at where you want to be. You're already looking at where your values are and your priorities are. If you're being super reactionary, I mean, this is where the difference comes into play with health and fitness. Being proactive in your health and fitness is like making sure you don't overeat, making sure you're not loading up on sodas all day long, drinking 15 energy drinks a day, stopping at gas stations, not working out, breaking your body down, and not ever making sure that you're strengthening your body up. And then coming to a point where you are forced to pivot because you go to the doctor and you've had too much alcohol and your liver is destroyed and you have a bunch of problems, or having a health scare in general, going to the hospital and not being able to be taken care of properly because you're not in good health, and then deciding to get your health in order. That's the difference between being proactive and reactive. Proactive, you would be working out, stretching, working on mobility, building your body up so that, you know, at a manual labor job, you're not wearing yourself down constantly and risking injuries. Um, making sure you're eating enough protein, not eating a bunch of trash and garbage, getting enough sleep, not over consuming alcohol, doing all that stuff. That's being proactive to your health. Reactive is just going by the seat of your pants until something happens and then being forced to take care of yourself or being out of work because you have, a serious health problem. You can go down the list. And in the end, it is hard to notice a pivot point if you are being reactive. But as long as you're being proactive, it really doesn't matter. The scale of the pivot, it doesn't matter if we're talking about natural occurrences like COVID happening and shutting everything down because nobody was really prepared for that. But the people that were thinking proactively very quickly and very efficiently got back on track, and they weren't out of work for more than, a couple weeks, and they adapted and overcame. And now when something like that happens again, they're going to be fine. But the people that were reactive at that time, they went out of business and were out of work for a year. People got laid off and were out of a job for a whole year and just lived off of the COVID um, reimbursement or whatever that was, and the unemployment and all of that, because all of that was bolstered for the people that are super reactive, couldn't find a job, didn't really care to find a job. And then when they finally do start going to find a job, they can't. This is this is all in the end, it's all the same. It's about being aware of what you're doing and thinking proactively, because no matter if it's a health scare, no matter if it's a change in the job market, no matter if it's a change in your um, in a new technology that comes out in your field of expertise, or when it's an employee that quits, or whatever you can think of, whatever pivot point you can think up in your mind, whether it's you try out something new in your business and it's not working out. If you are proactive, you will be able to recognize when it's time to change. When you are reactive, you will get hit with problems that you won't be able to control. And that's, I mean, it's super important. It's super important. This is really, when you boil everything down, this is what everybody needs to be doing. And this is what personal development is all about. It's all about preparing yourself, making yourself better to be able to have these challenges, meet these challenges and overcome them. Know when it's time to pivot and when you're being forced to pivot, being proactive versus reactive. You can notice early warning signs when it's time to pivot if you're being proactive and you're invested in your business, and you're thinking about what your next 10 steps are, and you see where you are in 5 years. You'll see it's not working in your priorities, or you see something's not working out. And if something isn't working, you can double down on it or pull back, and you'll know when it's time. You will. Being being forced to pivot really only happens to people that are reactive. And even if you're forced to pivot, as long as you're proactive, you'll be fine. So, guys, appreciate you listening into this podcast. It was kind of an ad hoc podcast, which seems like what a lot of these are. I go back and forth on whether or not I want to keep doing solo ones. I'll probably, this next year, I keep saying I might just do only interviews. That sounds like a lot of extra work. I think I like the 2 interviews, one solo schedule, and then 2 interviews and one solo. We'll kind of see how that goes. Appreciate you guys listening in, and we'll see you next week.